Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 5, which is the Precedence Network. This is one of the most important chapters uh, through the scheduling, because through this chapter you will learn how to use the four relationships of the connection or the diagram, which we'll talk about it here. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So again, precedence diagram method, PDM, uses node diagram with four types of logical relationships. Like as I said, you will be able to utilize, let me grab my pen here, those four approaches through this chapter, the precedence networks. Before, from chapter 4 and the previous chapters, we were able to learn the two networks, the nodes and the arrows, and how we draw our CPM. But through this chapter, things will get more complicated, because in the previous chapter, we used just the finish to start activities, which is the first one here, to be able to draw the CPM. But through this chapter and through the precedence networks, you will utilize the four of them. Well, actually the first three, because the four is kind of rare or seldom to use. So this is the most used approach. The three here, the second two are combined approaches, and the third one is almost never used. So this approach here was introduced by Professor John from Stanford University back in 1961. And through this network, we'll utilize lagged and leads and overlapping activities. And like I said here, your CPM calculation will be different from the one that we learned before. Having said that, two types of activities will be incorporated in our scheduling activities. The first one is contiguous, and the second one is interruptible. So we'll assume that all the activities are contiguous, and once we finish our diagram, then we go back to the diagram to introduce the interruptible activities, if there is any. And then for the float calculations, of course, it varies from an activity to activity, and according to this, we'll talk about it. Now, before moving forward, let's imagine we have a project to lay down a utility pipe. So the general concept of laying down this utility pipe, it goes through is going through 5 phases. So the first phase most commonly will be excavation. The second will be laying down the gravels or the bedding, and then the third activity is laying down the pipe itself, and then backfill and compact. So those are the 5 kind of main phases that this project could go through. This is simple and common sense if these activities are built using the bar chart in a consecutive order. But if you're going to use them in a consecutive order, no overlapping, if you give each activity like 2 days, then it'll be 10 days to finish these activities. But this is not how we typically schedule. We typically overlap them to be more efficient and utilize our resources wisely. So then if we're going to overlap them, how can we do that? Well, we typically look at them in a percentage-wise and see, for instance, trench excavation, get it started, and then for this activity, at least need to be done 20% of it for the sub base or the bedding to start, and so on and so forth for the rest of activities, for the rest of the activities. But with that, it's also still complicated. So that kind of led us to talk about the first approach of the overlapping activities, which is the ladder or the stair type relationships. So the way we do this is that each activity, it's broken down into multiple activities. For instance, the excavation activity is broken down into multiple activities, and the sub-base or the bedding activity is broken down into also multiple activities, and so on and so forth. So let's look at this example here. We have the excavation one started, and then finished to start. We have excavation two started once excavation one is done, but at the same time, sub-base one is started. And then once we finish sub-base one, excavation three started, and the sub-base two started, and pipe one, meaning laying down portion of the pipes, get started all in the same time. Once finishing pipe one, then sub-base three started, and pipes two started, and backfill one started. And then once the backfill one finishes or done, then pipes three started, and then backfill two started, and compact one started. Now, once compact one's done, then backfill three get started, and then compact two get started. And once everything is done and compacted two is done, then compacted three, it's also done, and so on and so forth. Now, what we can learn from this here is very detailed. Each activity is broken down. As you can see here, excavation one, it's broken down into excavation two and three. And sub-base one is two and three. Pipe one, pipes activity, laying the pipe is pipe one, pipe two, and pipe three, and so on and so forth. So as you can see here, is very detail oriented, and we can follow it through easily. However, this activity is mostly utilized for horizontal construction, not vertical. And in vertical construction is more complicated and it requires a lot of activities. Yes, in horizontal construction is easy to use because typically their activities are small, but those activities take longer. In construction, our vertical construction, our activities could take, each activity could take longer, yet and also in the same time, you have a lot of activities. So for 1,000 activity type of a project, if you're going to break down these activities each into like 3 or 4 or 5 activities, you'll end up with an overwhelmingly number of activities, which is unreasonable. So because of that, the stair or the ladder type of overlapping approach is not very practical for the vertical construction. And with that, we have to come up with another approach. So with that, I'll stop here. I'll continue on the next lecture.